I had always been drawn to the idea of living in a house with history, so when I found that old Victorian in a sleepy New England town, I thought I'd hit the jackpot. The realtor warned me that the house had a reputation, but I laughed it off. Ghost stories were for tourists, not for someone like me who'd spent years renovating old buildings. The first night I slept there, I was lulled to sleep by the creaks and groans of the old house settling. But then, as the clock struck midnight, I heard it, a soft, rhythmic sound that seemed to rise from the depths of the house itself. Inhale, exhale. The sound was so faint, I almost didn't notice it at first. I turned over, pulling the covers tight, telling myself it was just the wind. But the sound persisted, growing louder and more insistent. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was breathing just behind the wall. I pressed my ear to the cold plaster, straining to hear more. The breathing was steady, deliberate, as if something, or someone, was taking slow, deep breaths just inches away from me. I lay there, paralyzed with fear, unable to move, as the sound continued throughout the night. The next day, I tried to rationalize what I'd heard. Maybe it was the wind or an old ventilation system. But as I went about my day, the memory of that breathing haunted me. I could hear it in my mind, soft and steady, like a constant reminder that I was not alone, in that house. That night, the breathing returned, louder and more pronounced. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my heart racing. It was as if the sound was growing stronger, more present, like it was moving closer to me. I had to know what was behind that wall. I grabbed a flashlight and a hammer, my hands trembling as I approached the wall. I hesitated, listening to the deep, rhythmic breathing that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. Then, with a surge of adrenaline, I swung the hammer, chipping away at the plaster. The sound of my own pounding heart drowned out the breathing for a moment, but as I broke through the wall, the sound intensified. Behind the plaster was a narrow crawl space, pitch black and filled with a foul, musty odor. I shone the flashlight inside and felt a chill run down my spine. There, in the dust, were bones, human bones, scattered as if tossed aside. And then I saw it, a mummified corpse, its face twisted in a silent scream, as if it had been trapped there, unable to escape. As I stared in horror, the breathing grew louder, more erratic, like it was right in my ear. I stumbled back, dropping the flashlight, plunging the crawl space into darkness. The breathing was all around me now, deafening, suffocating. I could feel it, hot and damp against my skin, as if the walls themselves were alive, pressing in on me. I fled the house that night, leaving everything behind. I never returned, but sometimes, in the dead of night, I can still hear that breathing. It follows me in my dreams, a reminder that some secrets are better left buried. My uncle's house was a relic from another time, a massive, crumbling mansion on the outskirts of a small German village. I inherited it after his sudden death, and though I wasn't particularly close to him, the idea of owning such an estate intrigued me. The house was filled with strange and beautiful things, antique furniture, dusty paintings, and ancient relics from a forgotten era. But nothing in that house was as strange as what I found in the attic. The attic was a vast, shadowy space filled with boxes of old clothes, forgotten memories, and, in one corner, a life-sized mannequin. It was dressed in a tattered, old-fashioned gown, its face eerily lifelike. Its eyes were glassy, its skin pale and smooth, with a texture that seemed almost too real. The mannequin was positioned in the corner, facing the wall, as if someone had placed it there and never moved it. At first, I didn't think much of it. It was just another relic in a house full of strange things, but as the days passed, I started to notice something unsettling. Every time I went up to the attic, the mannequin seemed to have moved slightly. Its head was turned a bit more, or its hands had shifted positions. I told myself it was just my imagination, or maybe I was bumping into it without realizing it, but the changes were too precise, too deliberate. Then, one night, I heard something that made my blood run cold. I was lying in bed, drifting off to sleep, when I heard a soft thud from upstairs. It was a heavy, deliberate sound, like something being moved. I sat up, listening intently, my heart racing. Another thud, louder this time, echoed through the house. It was coming from the attic. I grabbed a flashlight and crept up the stairs, each step creaking under my weight. The attic door was ajar, and as I pushed it open, I felt a rush of cold air. The flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing the mannequin standing in the middle of the attic, facing me. Its head was tilted at an unnatural angle, its eyes staring straight into mine. But what made my stomach turn was its hand, which was now outstretched, pointing directly at me. I stumbled back, the flashlight shaking in my hand. The mannequin hadn't just moved, it had repositioned itself entirely. It was as if it had come to life, reaching out to me, trying to communicate something unspeakable. I could feel the cold sweat on my skin, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. I ran out of the attic, slamming the door behind me. I didn't sleep that night, or the next. The house felt alive, like it was watching me, waiting for me to let my guard down. I could feel the mannequin's gaze on me, even when I wasn't in the attic. It was always there, lurking in the shadows, waiting. I decided to get rid of it. I carried the mannequin down to the basement, its lifeless form heavy and cold in my arms. I placed it in the darkest corner, intending to dispose of it the next day. But that night, the house was filled with the sound of footsteps, soft, deliberate footsteps pacing back and forth, as if someone was searching for something. The footsteps grew louder, more frantic, until they stopped right outside my bedroom door. I held my breath, listening to the silence that followed. Then, with a creak, the door slowly opened, and I saw it, the mannequin, standing in the doorway, its head slowly turning to face me. Its eyes, once glassy and lifeless, were now dark and hollow, filled with something malevolent. I couldn't move, couldn't scream. As it took a step forward, its movements slow and deliberate. The cold, dead hands reached out to me, and I felt a surge of terror unlike anything I had ever experienced. With every ounce of strength I could muster, I leaped from my bed and ran past the mannequin, not daring to look back. I could feel its presence right behind me, its cold breath on the back of my neck. I fled the house, my heart pounding in my chest. The image of that twisted, moving mannequin burned into my mind. I never went back to that house. I sold it to the first buyer who didn't ask too many questions. But sometimes, when I'm alone in my apartment, I hear those same footsteps, soft and deliberate, pacing just outside my door. And I know, deep down, that the mannequin hasn't stopped looking for me. When I moved to Sao Paulo, I was excited to start a new chapter in my life. My apartment was small but cozy, and I enjoyed the bustling energy of the city. But that all changed when the faces started appearing. The first time it happened, I was sitting in my living room, enjoying a quiet evening. The curtains were drawn, but out of the corner of my eye, I saw something move. I glanced up, and there it was. A face, pressed against the glass, staring in at me. It was pale and expressionless, the eyes dark and hollow. I froze, but when I blinked, the face was gone. I told myself it was just a trick of the light, but the next night, it happened again. This time, it was a different face, a woman, her features twisted into a grotesque grimace, and then another, and another. Each night, more faces appeared, each one more horrifying than the last. I started keeping the curtains closed, but it didn't help. The faces would press against the glass, their eyes following me no matter where I went. I tried to ignore them, but they were relentless. I could feel their gaze on me, even when I couldn't see them. One night, the faces started appearing inside the apartment. I'd catch a glimpse of them in the mirrors, in the reflection of the TV screen, even in the glass of picture frames. They were everywhere, watching me, waiting for something. I started to lose sleep, the constant feeling of being watched driving me to the edge of sanity. I decided to do some research, hoping to find an explanation. That's when I discovered that the apartment building had been constructed on the site of an old cemetery, one that had been desecrated during the city's rapid expansion. The bodies had been moved, but the spirits had been disturbed, their final resting place violated. I packed my bags and left that night, too terrified to stay another minute. I moved to a new apartment across the city, far from the old building, but the faces followed me. I'd see them in the windows of the new place, in the mirrors, in the corners of my vision. They were always there, watching, waiting, and I knew that no matter where I went, they would never leave me alone. Living in a remote cabin in the Norwegian woods was supposed to be peaceful, a chance to disconnect from the world and find some solitude. The snow-covered landscape stretched out for miles, untouched and pure, with only the occasional whisper of wind disturbing the silence. It was the perfect place to escape from everything, or so I thought. The cabin itself was old but sturdy, built decades ago by a man who sought the same isolation I did. The locals in the nearest village, a good hour's drive away, had warned me about the harsh winters and the dangers of living alone in such a remote place. But I was undeterred. I relished the idea of being cut off from the world, surrounded by nothing but nature. The first few nights were serene, the kind of silence that felt almost sacred. But on the fourth night, I heard it. Footsteps in the snow, soft at first, like the faintest crunch of ice underfoot. I dismissed it as an animal, maybe a deer or a fox, but the sound was persistent, steady, and far too deliberate. It circled the cabin, the crunch of snow growing louder, closer. I grabbed my flashlight and peered out the window, but all I saw was a vast expanse of white, untouched by any tracks. My breath fogged up the glass as I strained to listen, the footsteps seeming to echo in the stillness of the night, but there was nothing. No sign of any intruder, no movement in the dark. The next morning, I ventured outside, half expecting to find tracks leading away from the cabin, but the snow was undisturbed, a perfect blanket of white stretching out as far as the eye could see. I shook my head, telling myself it was just my imagination, or perhaps the house settling in the cold. But that night, the footsteps returned, louder this time. They started at the edge of the woods, moving slowly, deliberately toward the cabin. My heart pounded in my chest as I listened, frozen with fear. The footsteps stopped right outside my door, and for a long moment, everything was deathly silent. Then, a single knock, a soft, almost hesitant tap on the wooden door. I didn't dare move. The knock came again, a little louder, followed by another and another. Whoever, or whatever, was outside wasn't leaving. The door rattled slightly as if someone was pressing against it, testing its strength. I could hear my own heartbeat, loud and frantic in my ears, as I slowly reached for the knife I kept by my bed. The knocking stopped suddenly, replaced by the sound of footsteps retreating back into the forest. I waited, barely breathing, until the sound faded into the night. When I finally worked up the courage to open the door, there was nothing there. No tracks, no sign that anyone had been there at all. But as I stepped outside, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There, in the snow, were bloody footprints, leading from the front door to the edge of the woods. The blood was fresh, glistening in the moonlight, and the footprints were human, barefoot with long, thin toes that seemed almost unnatural. I followed the footprints, my breath visible in the frigid air. They led me to a small clearing in the woods, where the snow was stained a deep, sickening red. There, lying in the snow, was a dead animal, its body torn apart, as if it had been savaged by something with claws. But the strangest part was the blood. It was still warm, steaming slightly in the cold air, and it was smeared all over the ground, as if something or someone had been rolling in it. I stumbled back, horror gripping me. The bloody footprints didn't belong to the animal. They were too human, too deliberate, and they didn't lead away from the clearing. They just stopped, as if whoever had made them had simply vanished into thin air. I raced back to the cabin, locking the door behind me, my hands trembling. The rest of the day passed in a blur, my mind racing with questions and fears. What had I seen? Who or what had been outside my cabin? And why had they left those bloody footprints behind? That night, I barely slept, jumping at every creak and groan of the old house. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows, but beneath it, I could still hear those footsteps, circling the cabin, growing closer. The knocking returned, louder this time, more insistent, as if whoever was out there was losing patience. I clutched the knife in my hand, heart pounding as the door shook on its hinges. The knocking became frantic, a furious pounding that echoed through the cabin. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The silence was deafening, the kind of silence that presses in on you from all sides, making you feel like you're the only person left in the world. I waited, counting the seconds, until I finally dared to look outside. The snow was untouched, no footprints, no blood, But as I turned to go back inside, I noticed something that made my stomach turn. There, in the fresh snow, were 2 handprints pressed deep into the white powder. They were large, with long, slender fingers, and they were smeared with blood. The next few nights were hell. The footsteps, the knocking, the blood, they all returned, night after night, driving me to the brink of madness. I couldn't sleep, couldn't think, couldn't escape the feeling that I was being watched, hunted by something unseen. The snow piled up outside, trapping me in the cabin, and I knew that if I didn't leave soon, I wouldn't survive. On the 7th night, the knocking didn't stop. The door burst open, and the cold rushed in, biting at my skin. Standing in the doorway was a figure, tall and gaunt, cloaked in darkness. Its eyes were hollow, empty voids that seemed to suck the light out of the room. The bloody footprints led straight to me, and I knew then that there was no escape. I don't remember what happened next. I woke up the next morning, lying in the snow outside the cabin, the door wide open. The footprints were gone, the clearing in the woods undisturbed, but the blood on my hands was real, and so was the terror that still grips me every night. I left the cabin that day, abandoning everything, but the nightmares followed me, the sound of those footsteps echoing in my mind. And sometimes, in the dead of night, I still hear that knocking, growing louder, more insistent, as if whatever was out there is still looking for me. I'd been living in this old Soviet-era apartment building in Moscow for a few months. The place was a relic of the past, with its crumbling walls and rusty pipes, but it was cheap and close to work, so I didn't mind. The neighbors were quiet, the kind who kept to themselves, and the building had an eerie, almost oppressive atmosphere that seemed to seep into your bones. But it wasn't until winter set in that things started to get truly strange. One night, as I was lying in bed, I heard it, a faint, muffled scream. It was so quiet I almost didn't hear it at first, but then it came again, a little louder this time. It was coming from the pipes, echoing through the walls. The sound was distorted, as if someone was screaming through water, but the fear in that voice was unmistakable. I sat up, heart racing, and strained to listen. The scream faded away, leaving behind an unsettling silence. I tried to tell myself it was just the old pipes groaning in the cold, but deep down, I knew that wasn't true. The next night, the screams returned, more urgent this time. It was a woman's voice, filled with terror, begging for help. I could hear the desperation in her tone, the way her voice cracked as if she'd been screaming for hours. I started asking my neighbors if they'd heard anything, but they all looked at me like I was crazy. They shook their heads, muttering about how the building was old and creaky and sounds carried in strange ways. But I knew what I heard. I wasn't imagining it. The screams continued, night after night, growing louder, more desperate. They always started around midnight, echoing through the pipes, filling my apartment with that horrible guttural sound. I tried everything to drown them out, playing music, wearing earplugs, but nothing worked. The screams cut through everything, penetrating my mind, making it impossible to sleep. I became obsessed with finding the source. I spent hours tapping on walls, listening to the pipes, trying to trace the sound to its origin. The building was a maze of narrow hallways and hidden rooms, and I started to wonder if there were places in the building that no one knew about, secret spaces where someone could be trapped, screaming for help. One night, the screams were so loud they seemed to shake the walls. I grabbed a wrench and stormed into the bathroom, determined to get to the bottom of this. The sound was coming from the pipes in the wall, louder than ever, as if the woman was right on the other side, just out of reach. I began dismantling the pipes, my hands shaking with fear and frustration. As I pulled apart the old, rusted metal, a foul smell filled the room, a sickening mix of decay and rot. I gagged, but I didn't stop. I had to know. I had to find out what was making that noise. And then, deep within the pipes, I found it, a bundle of old, wet rags, stuffed into the narrow space, blocking the flow of water. I pulled them out, the stench almost overwhelming, and as I did, something tumbled out, a small, withered hand, mummified and grotesque. I dropped it, stumbling back in horror as the screams suddenly stopped, replaced by an eerie, oppressive silence. I stared at the hand, my mind reeling, trying to comprehend what I was seeing. I called the police, my hands still trembling, and they arrived within minutes. The officers were grim as they examined the hand, their expressions darkening as they uncovered more. A skull, pieces of bone, all crammed into the pipes. The remains were old, decades old, and the police theorized that they had been hidden there during the Soviet era, a time when people disappeared and were never heard from again. But that didn't explain the screams. The officers were skeptical when I told them about the noises, dismissing it as the building's old plumbing. But I knew what I had heard. I knew that someone, something, had been trapped in those walls, their voice echoing through the pipes, calling for help that never came. I moved out the next day, unable to stay in that apartment for another night. But the screams have never left me. Even now, in the quiet moments before sleep, I can still hear them, faint and distant, as if they're calling to me from the other side, begging me to come back, to listen, to help. And I know that somewhere, in that old, decaying building, those silent screams are still echoing, trapped in the walls, waiting for someone to hear them. It all started when I moved into my grandmother's old house after she passed away. The place was ancient, creaking with every step, the kind of house that seemed to breathe on its own. It had been in our family for generations, and as a child, I remembered it as a warm, welcoming place. But now, living alone in that house, it felt different, darker, heavier, like something was watching me. The first few nights were uneventful, just me getting used to the old house's quirks, the groaning pipes, the rattling windows, the floorboards that seemed to shift underfoot. But then, I started hearing noises from the attic. It began as a soft thump, like something heavy being dropped, followed by a series of dragging sounds. At first, I thought it might be rats or squirrels, but the sounds were too deliberate, too human. One night, I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed a flashlight and decided to investigate. The attic was at the top of a narrow staircase, the door creaking open with a groan that echoed through the house. As I climbed the stairs, the air grew colder, thicker, and the smell of dust and decay filled my nostrils. The attic was dark, the only light coming from my trembling flashlight. Old furniture was covered in sheets, creating ghostly shapes that loomed in the shadows. I called out, hoping to scare off whatever was up there, but my voice sounded small, swallowed by the oppressive silence. I moved deeper into the attic, the floorboards creaking under my weight. The sound of dragging returned, closer now, and I spun around, shining the light in every direction, but there was nothing, just the empty room and the stale air pressing in on me. And then I saw it. In the corner, where the light barely reached, something moved. It was a shape, hunched over, as if it was crouching behind one of the old trunks. My breath caught in my throat as I slowly approached, my heart pounding so loudly I could barely hear anything else. The shape didn't move, didn't make a sound, but I could feel its eyes on me, cold and menacing. I raised the flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness, and what I saw nearly made me drop it. It was a figure, pale and gaunt, its skin stretched tightly over its bones. Its eyes were wide, unblinking, filled with a kind of hunger that made my skin crawl. The thing was silent, its mouth twisted into a grotesque grin that showed rows of sharp, yellowed teeth. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over a broken chair as the figure began to move, crawling toward me on all fours. It didn't make a sound, but I could hear its breath, rasping, hungry, echoing in the stillness of the attic. I turned and ran, not caring about the noise I made, my only thought to get out of that house. The thing behind me was fast, its limbs scuttling across the floor like a spider, its breath hot on my neck. I burst through the attic door, slamming it shut behind me, and I heard the thing crash against it with a force that rattled the entire house. I didn't stop running until I was outside, the cold night air biting at my skin. The house loomed behind me, dark and silent, the attic window staring down like a malevolent eye. I could feel it watching me, the thing in the attic, waiting for me to return. I left that house the next day, never looking back. But the memory of those cold, hungry eyes haunts me, and sometimes, late at night, I can still hear the sound of something dragging itself across the floor, coming closer, always closer. I just finished a long day at work and was looking forward to a quiet evening at home. I lived alone in a small apartment on the outskirts of town, a modest place, nothing fancy. But it was mine, the kind of place where nothing exciting ever happened, and that was just the way I liked it. But that night, as I was settling in on the couch with a movie, I heard a knock at the door. It was late, too late for visitors, and the sound immediately put me on edge. I paused the movie, listening as the knock came again, this time louder, more insistent. I got up, hesitating for a moment before peering through the peephole. The hallway outside was dimly lit, and at first I didn't see anything. But then I noticed it, a shadow, shifting just out of view, as if someone was standing just out of sight. "Who's there?" I called. My voice steady despite the unease creeping up my spine. No answer, just another knock, harder this time, almost angry. I should have ignored it. I know that now. But curiosity got the better of me. I unlocked the door and opened it just a crack, enough to peer outside. The hallway was empty, the only sound the faint hum of the building's heating system. I stepped out, looking left and right, but there was no one there, just shadows flickering in the dim light. I was about to close the door when I noticed something on the floor, a small, crumpled piece of paper. I picked it up, my heart pounding as I unfolded it. The paper was old, yellowed with age, and the writing was smeared, almost unreadable. But I could make out one word, scrawled in thick black letters: "Run." A chill ran down my spine as I glanced around the empty hallway again. The air felt colder, heavier, as if the shadows themselves were closing in. I quickly retreated back into my apartment, locking the door behind me, my hands shaking. I didn't know what to make of the note, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. I tried to go back to watching my movie, but I couldn't focus. The unease gnawed at me, growing with each passing minute. I kept glancing at the door, expecting another knock, but it never came. The apartment felt too quiet, too still, as if the very air was holding its breath. And then, just as I was starting to relax, the lights went out. The sudden darkness was suffocating, the shadows in the room seeming to stretch and twist into something unnatural. I fumbled for my phone, my hands trembling as I turned on the flashlight. The beam of light cut through the darkness, but it did little to ease my fear. The room felt wrong, distorted, like I was seeing it through a warped lens. The shadows seemed to pulse, moving on their own, and I could swear I heard whispers, faint, sinister, coming from somewhere just out of sight. I backed away, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps, and that's when I saw it. In the corner of the room, where the light barely reached, was a figure. It was tall and thin, its limbs unnaturally long, and its face, God, its face, was just a dark void, a gaping maw that seemed to suck in all the light around it. The thing moved, stepping forward with a slow, deliberate motion, and I could feel its eyes on me, even though it had no face. I wanted to scream, to run, but I was frozen, rooted to the spot by some invisible force. The figure reached out, its long, spindly fingers stretching toward me, and I felt a coldness seep into my bones, a deep, paralyzing fear that gripped my heart. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, as if they were urging the thing on, and I knew, somehow I knew, that if it touched me, I would never be the same again. In a last, desperate act, I hurled my phone at the thing, the light spinning wildly as it flew through the air. The figure recoiled, the shadows around it shuddering as if in pain, and I took my chance. I ran, blindly stumbling through the darkness, my only thought to get out, to escape. I don't remember how I made it to the front door, but I did. I threw it open, practically falling into the hallway, and slammed it shut behind me. The cold air of the corridor hit me like a wave, and I realized I was shaking, my body trembling with fear. I never went back to that apartment. I left everything behind, moving across town to a new place where the shadows didn't seem so dark and the silence didn't weigh so heavily. But even now, in the dead of night, I can still feel its eyes on me, watching, waiting for the moment I let my guard down. My house was at the end of a quiet suburban street surrounded by tall trees that blocked out the city's noise. It was the kind of place where nothing ever happened, where the biggest excitement was the occasional raccoon tipping over a trash can. But that all changed one summer night when I saw the face at the window. I had just settled into bed, the cool breeze from the open window lulling me to sleep. The house was quiet, the only sound the faint rustling of leaves outside. I was drifting off when I felt it. A strange sensation, like I was being watched. My eyes snapped open, and for a moment, everything was still. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I was tired, and tried to relax. But then, I felt it again, stronger this time, as if someone, or something, was right outside my window, staring in. I slowly turned my head, my heart pounding in my chest. The moonlight filtered through the curtains, casting long shadows across the room, and for a moment, I saw nothing. But then, just as my eyes began to adjust, I saw it, a face, pale and ghostly, staring back at me through the glass. The face was pressed up against the window, its features distorted by the glass, but I could see enough to know it wasn't human. The eyes were too large, too dark, like bottomless pits that seemed to draw me in. The skin was ashen, almost translucent, and the mouth was twisted into a grotesque grin, revealing sharp, jagged teeth. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The face didn't move, didn't blink, just stared at me with those cold, dead eyes. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't obey. It was like I was trapped, paralyzed by the sheer terror of what I was seeing. And then, slowly, the face began to move. It slid along the window, its eyes never leaving mine, as it made its way to the edge of the frame. I could hear a faint scraping sound, like nails dragging across the glass, and it sent a shiver down my spine. The face disappeared from view, and for a moment, there was only silence. I lay there, my heart racing, every nerve in my body on edge, waiting for something to happen. And then, I heard it, the sound of footsteps, soft but deliberate, making their way around the house. I bolted upright, my fear finally propelling me into action. I scrambled out of bed and ran to the window, my hands shaking as I yanked the curtains closed. I could still hear the footsteps, now coming from the side of the house, slow and measured, as if whoever, or whatever it was taking its time. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, my fingers fumbling on the screen. As I waited for the operator to pick up, I backed away from the window, my eyes darting around the room, looking for something, anything, that I could use to defend myself. The operator's voice crackled through the phone, and I quickly explained what was happening, my words tumbling out in a panicked rush. She assured me that help was on the way, but her voice seemed distant, almost unreal, like I was hearing it through a fog. The footsteps were closer now, right outside the front door, and I could hear the faint creak of the porch steps as they were slowly, deliberately climbed. I backed into the corner of the room, the phone clutched to my ear, my breath coming in short, terrified gasps, and then the knocking started. It was soft at first, almost polite, like a gentle tap, but it quickly grew louder, more insistent, the sound reverberating through the house. I pressed myself against the wall, my mind racing, trying to think of what to do. The knocking stopped, and for a moment, there was nothing but silence. And then, the door handle began to turn. It was slow, deliberate, the metal creaking as it twisted. I could see the outline of the figure through the frosted glass, tall and thin, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. I held my breath, praying that the door would hold, that the lock would keep it out. But deep down, I knew it wouldn't. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't bound by the same rules as the rest of us. It was here for me, and it wasn't going to leave empty-handed. Just as the door began to creak open, I heard the sound of sirens in the distance. The figure froze, its head snapping toward the sound, and for a brief moment, I felt a flicker of hope. But then, with a sudden jerking motion, it turned and disappeared into the night, the door slamming shut behind it with a force that rattled the walls. The police arrived minutes later, but by then, the figure was long gone. They searched the area but found no trace of it, no footprints, no signs of forced entry, nothing. It was as if it had never been there at all. But I knew better. I could still feel its eyes on me, watching, waiting for the next opportunity to strike. And every night since, as I lie in bed, I can't help but wonder if it's out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for me to let my guard down. After I bought my first home, an old Victorian house on the outskirts of town, I was thrilled. The place was charming, with its creaky wooden floors and antique fixtures. It felt like stepping back in time, and I was eager to make it my own. But as the days passed, I began to notice something unsettling, whispers, faint and indistinct, coming from the walls. At first, I thought it was just the house settling, the old wood groaning in response to the weather. But the whispers grew louder, more insistent, until they were impossible to ignore. They would start at night, just as I was drifting off to sleep, a soft, sibilant sound that seemed to come from all around me. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, the result of living alone in an unfamiliar place. But the whispers were too clear, too distinct. They sounded like voices, murmuring just below the threshold of hearing, speaking a language I couldn't understand. One night, I decided to investigate. I followed the sound through the darkened house, my heart pounding as I moved from room to room. The whispers seemed to be everywhere, surrounding me, but always just out of reach. Finally, I found myself in the basement, the cold stone walls pressing in on me as I descended the stairs. The whispers were louder now, almost deafening, and I could feel a cold sweat breaking out on my skin. I reached the bottom of the stairs, the air thick with dust and the smell of damp earth. The basement was dimly lit, the only light coming from a single, flickering bulb hanging from the ceiling. The whispers seemed to be coming from behind one of the walls, a low, rhythmic murmur that made my skin crawl. I approached the wall, my hand trembling as I reached out to touch it. The moment my fingers made contact, the whispers stopped, replaced by a deafening silence. I stood there, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps, waiting for something, anything to happen. And then, the wall began to move. It wasn't a physical movement, but something deeper, like the very fabric of reality was shifting before my eyes. The stone seemed to ripple, distorting the air around it, and I could feel a pressure building, as if something was trying to break through. I stumbled back, my heart racing as the whispers returned, louder and more frantic than before. They were no longer indistinct, but clear, the voices overlapping in a chaotic, dissonant chorus. I couldn't understand the words, but the tone was unmistakable. Anger, desperation, fear. And then, with a sudden, violent crash, the wall gave way. The stone crumbled, revealing a dark, gaping hole that seemed to stretch into infinity. The air around me grew colder, and I could feel a presence, something old, something malevolent, pushing against the edges of reality, trying to break through. I turned and ran, my footsteps echoing in the narrow stairwell as I fled the basement. The whispers followed me, growing louder and more frantic with each step, until they were a deafening roar, drowning out all other sound. I barely made it to the top of the stairs before the door slammed shut behind me, the force of it nearly knocking me off my feet. The whispers stopped, replaced by an eerie silence that pressed in on me from all sides. I didn't go back to the basement after that. I couldn't. The memory of that night, of the whispers and the dark hole in the wall, haunted me, filling me with a deep, unshakable dread. I knew that something was down there, something that should never have been disturbed, and that it was only a matter of time before it found a way out. But the whispers never stopped. Even now, as I lie in bed, I can hear them, faint but persistent, seeping through the walls, reminding me that it's still down there, waiting, biding its time. I had always prided myself on being a rational person. I didn't believe in ghosts or the supernatural, or anything that couldn't be explained by logic and reason. But that all changed when I moved into my new apartment and started hearing the footsteps. The apartment was small but cozy, perfect for one person. It was on the top floor of an old building with creaky floors and thin walls. I could hear my neighbors' conversations, the sound of water running through the pipes, and the occasional footsteps from the hallway. But these footsteps were different. They were inside my apartment. It started late one night, just as I was getting ready for bed. I was brushing my teeth when I heard it, a faint, rhythmic sound, like someone pacing back and forth in the living room. I paused, listening, but the sound stopped. I shrugged it off, thinking it must be the neighbors, and went to bed. But the footsteps returned the next night, and the night after that. Always the same, slow, deliberate, like someone pacing just out of sight. I tried to ignore it, to convince myself it was just the building settling, but the sound was too distinct, too close. One night, I decided to stay up and see if I could catch whatever was making the noise. I sat in the dark, my ears straining to hear, and just after midnight the footsteps began. They started in the living room, moving slowly toward the bedroom. I held my breath, my heart pounding in my chest as the sound grew closer until it was right outside my door. I waited, expecting the door to open, for someone to step inside, but the footsteps stopped. I sat there, frozen, listening to the silence, waiting for something to happen. But there was nothing, just the faint sound of my own breathing and the distant hum of the city outside. I finally worked up the courage to get up and check, but when I opened the door, the hallway was empty. The living room was just as I'd left it, the furniture undisturbed, no sign that anyone had been there. I was about to turn back when I noticed something on the floor, a small, crumpled piece of paper. I picked it up, my hands trembling as I unfolded it. The paper was old, yellowed with age, and the writing was faded, almost illegible. But I could make out one word, scrawled in jagged letters: leave. A chill ran down my spine as I looked around the empty room. The footsteps had stopped, but I could still feel a presence, something watching me, waiting. I decided then and there that I couldn't stay in that apartment any longer. The next morning, I packed my things and left, not bothering to explain to the landlord. I moved across town to a new apartment in a newer building with thick walls and solid floors. But even now, I can't shake the feeling that I'm not alone. Sometimes, late at night, I hear the footsteps again, faint and distant, like an echo from another time. And I wonder if whatever was in that apartment followed me, if it's still waiting for the right moment to make itself known. The winter storm was worse than anyone had predicted. The snow fell in thick, blinding sheets, piling up against the windows and burying the roads. I had planned to spend the evening alone, curled up with a good book and a cup of hot cocoa, but as the wind howled outside, rattling the shutters, I realized that this night was going to be far from cozy. I lived alone in a small cabin deep in the woods, miles away from the nearest town. It was a peaceful place, surrounded by tall pines and thick underbrush, the kind of place where I could lose myself in nature and forget about the world. But tonight, the isolation felt oppressive, the darkness outside impenetrable. The power went out just as I was settling into my chair, plunging the cabin into darkness. I cursed under my breath, fumbling for the flashlight I kept in the drawer. The beam of light cut through the shadows, but it did little to dispel the unease that had settled over me. I decided to light a fire, hoping the warmth and light would help all calm my nerves. The flames crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows across the walls, but the howling wind outside seemed to grow louder, more insistent, as if something was trying to get in. I tried to distract myself with my book, but I couldn't focus. The storm was too loud, the wind screaming through the trees, shaking the cabin to its very foundations. And then, just as I was starting to relax, I heard it, a knock at the door. I froze, the book slipping from my hands. The knock came again, louder this time, and my heart skipped a beat. Who could be out in a storm like this? The nearest neighbor was miles away, and the roads were completely impassable. I grabbed the flashlight and cautiously approached the door, my pulse racing. I hesitated for a moment, listening, but the knocking continued, slow and deliberate. Taking a deep breath, I unlocked the door and opened it just a crack. The wind howled in, icy and sharp, but there was no one there, just the swirling snow, thick and blinding, and the dark outline of the trees beyond. I stepped outside, the cold biting through my clothes, and looked around, but the night was empty. The only sound was the wind, shrieking through the pines like a banshee. I quickly retreated back inside, slamming the door shut behind me, I locked it, my hands shaking, and backed away, my mind racing. Had I imagined it? Was the storm playing tricks on my ears? But no, there had been a knock, I was sure of it. I tried to calm down, telling myself there was nothing to worry about. But just as I was starting to relax, the knocking started again. This time, it was louder, more insistent, like someone or something was pounding on the door with all their might. I stumbled back, the flashlight trembling in my grip. The knocking was relentless, shaking the door on its hinges, and I could hear something else now, a voice, faint and distant, calling my name. My blood ran cold. The voice was familiar but distorted, like it was coming from far away. It was a voice I hadn't heard in years, a voice that belonged to someone who was long dead. "Let me in," the voice pleaded, echoing through the storm. "Please, let me in." I backed away, my heart hammering in my chest. I knew I shouldn't open the door, that whatever was out there wasn't human. But the voice, it was so familiar, so desperate. It tugged at something deep inside me, filling me with a mix of fear and longing. "Please," the voice called again, louder this time. "It's so cold out here." I pressed my hands over my ears, trying to block out the sound, but it only grew louder, more insistent. The knocking was frantic now, the door rattling on its hinges, and I could hear the voice clear as day, as if it was right next to me. "Let me in," it screamed, the sound almost inhuman in its intensity. "Let me in." I stumbled back, nearly tripping over the chair, my mind racing. I couldn't open the door, I knew that, but the voice, it was so familiar, so real, and the knocking, it was so loud, so relentless. I had to make it stop. I moved to the door, my heart pounding in my chest. My hand hovered over the lock, trembling with fear and indecision. The voice was so close now, so desperate, and I could feel the cold seeping through the door, as if the very air was alive with malevolence. "Please," the voice whispered, soft and pleading, "let me in." My hand moved to the lock, almost of its own accord, and I froze, torn between terror and an inexplicable need to open the door. But just as my fingers brushed the cold metal, the voice changed. It became deeper, darker, filled with a malice that sent a shiver down my spine. "Let me in," it roared, shaking the door with a force that rattled the walls. "Let me in." I jerked my hand back, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. I knew then that whatever was outside wasn't human, that it was something dark and malevolent, something that had taken the voice of someone I loved to lure me in. I stumbled back, tripping over the chair and falling to the floor. The knocking was deafening now, the door shaking as if it was about to burst off its hinges, and the voice, God, the voice, was a cacophony of rage and despair, screaming to be let in. But I didn't move. I stayed on the floor, my hands pressed over my ears, my eyes squeezed shut, praying for the storm to end, for the night to pass, for the thing at the door to go away. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the knocking stopped. The voice fell silent, and the wind outside seemed to die down, leaving only an eerie, oppressive stillness. I stayed there for what felt like hours, too terrified to move until the first light of dawn began to creep through the windows. Only then did I find the courage to get up and approach the door. My hands trembled as I unlocked it and slowly opened the door. The storm had passed, leaving a blanket of snow covering the ground, but there were no footprints, no sign that anyone had been there. The only evidence of the night's events was the door itself, covered in deep, jagged scratches, as if something with claws had tried to force its way in. I never spent another night in that cabin. I packed my things and left that very day, leaving the place behind without a second glance. But even now, in the dead of night, I sometimes hear that voice, faint and distant, calling to me from the shadows, begging to be let in. And I know, deep down, that it's still out there, waiting for me to make the mistake of opening the door. I just finished a long day at work and was looking forward to a quiet evening at home. I lived alone in a small apartment on the outskirts of Town, a modest place, nothing fancy, but it was mine. The kind of place where nothing exciting ever happened, and that was just the way I liked it. But that night, As I was settling in on the couch with a movie, I heard a knock at the door. It was late, too late for visitors, and the sound immediately put me on edge. I paused the movie, listening as the knock came again, this time louder, more insistent. I got up, hesitating for a moment before peering through the peephole. The hallway outside was dimly lit, and at first I didn't see anything. But then I noticed it, a shadow shifting just out of view, as if someone was standing just out of sight. "Who's there?" I called, my voice steady despite the unease creeping up my spine. No answer, just another knock, harder this time, almost angry. I should have ignored it, I know that now. But curiosity got the better of me. I unlocked the door and opened it just a crack, enough to peer outside. The hallway was empty, the only sound the faint hum of the building's heating system. I stepped out, looking left and right, but there was no one there, just shadows flickering in the dim light. I was about to close the door when I noticed something on the floor, a small, crumpled piece of paper. I picked it up, my heart pounding as I unfolded it. The paper was old, yellowed with age, and the writing was smeared, almost unreadable. But I could make out one word, scrawled in thick black letters: "Run." A chill ran down my spine as I glanced around the empty hallway again. The air felt colder, heavier, as if the shadows themselves were closing in. I quickly retreated back into my apartment, locking the door behind me, my hands shaking. I didn't know what to make of the note, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. I tried to go back to watching my movie, but I couldn't focus. The unease gnawed at me, growing with each passing minute. I kept glancing at the door, expecting another knock, but it never came. The apartment felt too quiet, too still, as if the very air was holding its breath. And then, just as I was starting to relax, the lights went out. The sudden darkness was suffocating, the shadows in the room seeming to stretch and twist into something unnatural. I fumbled for my phone, my hands trembling as I turned on the flashlight. The beam of light cut through the darkness, but it did little to ease my fear. The room felt wrong, distorted, like I was seeing it through a warped lens. The shadows seemed to pulse, moving on their own, and I could swear I heard whispers, faint, sinister, coming from somewhere just out of sight. I backed away, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps, and that's when I saw it. In the corner of the room, where the light barely reached, was a figure. It was tall and thin, its limbs unnaturally long, and its face, God, its face, was just a dark void, a gaping maw that seemed to suck in all the light around it. The thing moved, stepping forward with a slow, deliberate motion, and I could feel its eyes on me, even though it had no face. I wanted to scream, to run, but I was frozen, rooted to the spot by some invisible force. The figure reached out, its long, spindly fingers stretching toward me, and I felt a coldness seep into my bones, a deep, paralyzing fear that gripped my heart. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, as if they were urging the thing on, and I knew, somehow I knew, that if it touched me, I would never be the same again. In a last, desperate act, I hurled my phone at the thing, the light spinning wildly as it flew through the air. The figure recoiled, the shadows around it shuddering as if in pain, and I took my chance. I ran, blindly stumbling through the darkness, my only thought to get out, to escape. I don't remember how I made it to the front door, but I did. I threw it open, practically falling into the hallway, and slammed it shut behind me. The cold air of the corridor hit me like a wave, and I realized I was shaking, my body trembling with fear. I never went back to that apartment. I left everything behind, moving across town to a new place where the shadows didn't seem so dark and the silence didn't weigh so heavily. But even now, in the dead of night, I can still feel its eyes on me, watching, waiting for the moment I let my guard down.